welcome to Turn the Page, the official podcast of the Syosset Public Library.
Hi, this is Syosset Library's Turn the Page podcast. I am Jessica. I am here today with the author Carter Wilson, who I spoke to last year about The Father That She Went to Find, which was such a good book. It was so incredibly good. And I was just telling Carter how excited I was when I saw Carter's name come up as a possible interview subject, because I loved the last book of his and I thought the premise of this one sounded really great. And when I started reading You Know What You Did, I was like, oh my goodness, I don't know. I enjoyed the last one and I feel like I'm enjoying this one maybe more, but just in a different way. And it's a very different book. And I applaud you for really doing something different in your books. So first of all, enough preamble. Carter Wilson, welcome to Turn
Jessica,
the Page.
thank you.
Welcome
so
back.
Great to be here and talk to you again.
Yeah, let's talk about You Know What You Did. Tell me about this book and how this all came about.
Yeah, so I mean, you mentioned The Father She Went to Find, and that was a struggle of a book. It was a little bit of a departure for me, and it probably took me the longest it's taken me in a long time to write a book, maybe a couple years, which is rare. And so I remember when I finished that process and I had this very, very, very small nugget of an idea for Tell Me What You Did, I knew I wanted to write something very straightforward, very in your face, kind of angry, but just a release. And because I kind of had went through so much turmoil with the previous book, I just wanted to write something that was just, breathless. And because that was my mood. And I think a lot of writers do that. It's like, what am I in the mood to write? And I just remember it flowed out of me because, again, I had this nugget of an idea and I don't outline. So I was, obviously making it up as I go along, but it just came. And I don't know if that was just a reflection of the zeitgeist or my mood at the time, but I just remember being able to kind of sustain that pace and wrote the book very quickly.
I love that you said that this book just kind of fell out of you. It was a page turner. It was a read it in one sitting book. And like I said, I loved The Father That She Went to Find. This one, again, it centers around a young woman who has a mysterious past, but it's very different. So she's a true crime podcaster. Her name is Poe, and her podcast centers around getting people to confess to crimes that they committed.
Right.
And she does this with her boyfriend Kip, who is like her partner, but also helps her produce the podcast. And things go sideways from there. So you said that it started with a nugget of the idea. Where did that nugget begin, and how did the whole story unfold in your mind?
Yeah, great question. I mean, inspiration for books comes from a number of different places. And for me, they're these very opaque, intangible ideas that give me goosebumps, but it's not fully fleshed by any means. And I remember I had a buddy of mine, Blake, who, we used to kind of exchange podcast recommendations. And he was telling me about a podcast he was listening to. And yeah, I feel bad. I don't remember the name of it. I never listened to it because I didn't want to ruin things for me. But the idea was basically, it was like a phone number you could call and leave an apology for anyone in the universe, and they would just play these recordings. And I immediately thought, like, what if you left a message and it was a confession? And so that's how it all started. So I really started thinking about it. And in the case of the book, Poeb, the host, she started to do this podcast almost as this means of, self-therapy. Because she's had this very traumatic childhood. She witnessed her mother's brutal murder. And this podcast just started to blow up, and it got to the point where it reached #1 status in US podcasts. So she's a known entity. And so I kind of started with that premise. And then as you write, it's just like, all right, what happens next? What would you do? And I just kind of write very linear from that first person present tense perspective of like, okay, this has just happened. What next? And you just try to keep that pace up. And, it kind of is this breakneck speed that you try to sustain throughout the course of the thriller.
So I really liked the way that you kind of jumped back and forth through timelines. You jump to the thing that's very urgent that's happening now, and you get sort of an outline of, Poe is in trouble, someone she cares about is in trouble, and then how everything kind of built up, and then you fill in here and there Poe's story about how she had witnessed her mom getting murdered as a child. Uh, did you write all of that out of sequence?
No, that's all in sequence. And it's interesting. And I kind of do that a lot because you think about you have a character who is making decisions and has a past, and the decisions they're making is kind of informed by who they were growing up. And one easy thing to do, which is I think not the best thing to do, is to just in exposition kind of have this backstory of like, this is what it is. I prefer to jump back and actually visually see the scene like this is actually what happened, and we're living it in present tense even though it's whatever 15 years ago. So as I'm writing, you find that place where it just feels right of like, okay, now's the time to let the readers know what that trauma actually was, and let's all experience it together. But sometimes you move it around and you're not sure where it's going to play best, and you got to make sure you're not taking the reader too much out of the story from the current events. But you have to have that stuff because that explains why the character is who they are.
Definitely. And I like that, I think it's actually in the blurb, so we're not really giving too much away. Poe gets a call from somebody,
Yeah.
who has intimate knowledge about her mother's murder, and this knocks her off her feet because she has some secrets of her own, things that she knows about, or she thinks she knows about what happened to the person who murdered her mother. And that is in and of itself very interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it really takes some different avenues, not just with how Poe relates to this person who calls to confess and turns out to be a menacing figure in her adult life, but also just how she relates to Kip and also her father, who was left behind by this horrible murder
Right.
itself. So, I think like one of the things that I really loved in the father that she went to find was the interpersonal relationships of, I believe it was Penny, and just the people who
Yeah.
she met, like her found family almost. But here it's like her actual family that she's keeping at arm's length, and part of it is because of some of the secrets that she's been keeping. um
Right.
yeah. I mean, you say that you write as you go along. Was there just a point where all of the secrets just kind of felt like they were clicking into place?
Yeah, it takes a lot of rewriting, and it takes a lot of beta readers, and it takes your agent and your editor to help you out as well. But you do just kind of trust your instinct after a while, like, hey, if I'm reading this or if I were consuming this as a TV series or a movie, what feels right in terms of when things are revealed and how much is revealed. And to your point, it's kind of interesting. The back cover copy does outline, what Poe is hiding. And I remember having that discussion of like, is this giving away too much? And my editor's like, no, I think this is really what is going to pull people in. But in short, Poe has this massive, secret. Poe has her own criminal history that she is hidden from the world, even though she invites people onto her podcast to confess their own crimes. And so a lot of the book is actually transcripts of Poe and this menacing figure on her own podcast, where he's trying to get her to confess to what she did before he reveals it to the world. So she's got a lot to lose, but she also needs to know who this guy is.
Yeah, like I don't want to say it's a cat and mouse. It's almost like a cat and a feral cat. Right? Like they're circling each other, and the house cat might be pampered but has like some of her own instincts there, and the feral cat is just feral.
Yeah,
And
totally.
they're really just sort of like I said, like circling one another, sort of reading the situation to see how it's going to play out. I will say that I did not read the full back blurb before
Oh,
I read
yeah.
the book. I
I
saw
prefer to do that as well.
Yeah, I saw what the book was about, and I saw that you were the author, and automatically I knew I wanted to talk to you again, and I wanted to read this book. But that is very interesting that that decision was made, because then when I finally went back and I read it, like the full thing, I was like, I do wonder, if I would have felt differently if I had known the thing that, and I'm not saying it
Yeah,
out loud because
right, right.
I don't know if people who are listening to this are going to want to know this right away. Like I would like to
Yeah,
hope that this entices people enough to pick up the book, whether or not you know this. But I did almost feel, like I wasn't sure. Like I still would have probably read it, but that was a very interesting choice on behalf of
yeah,
the publisher.
yeah, yeah. I mean, and it kind of establishes the book as a revenge thriller, which it is. And what I love about revenge thrillers, I love to write them, but I really love to investigate. Okay, you've gotten your revenge. You still have to deal with that. Everyone, usually revenge happens at the end of a story, right? And it's this feel good, oh, you've gotten the bad guy. But the reality of it is, you enact revenge on somebody, that doesn't mean that you're necessarily found peace. What are the ramifications of that? How long does that linger? And I loved kind of playing with that idea, the psychology of revenge, as being kind of a potentially very unsatisfying act. That's not the thing that you might use to find peace and to let go.
Yes, absolutely. I really did enjoy the direction everything took. And I liked the characters. I liked, like I think I mentioned before, I liked that Poe, she was not 100% likable. But I
Right.
understood where she was coming from. And I think that that's something to be said. I thought that when you kind of saw her thought process, and just about how like the things that had been dredged up from her past, how they came about, I was fascinated. I was like, wow, that's actually really smart. So she is smart, she's prickly. You understand where she's coming from. She witnessed something absolutely awful. And then you have like the people who really loved her, like her dad and Kip, who, it's almost like she's very self-destructive because she has to keep them at that distance in order to protect them from what she perceives herself as, whereas this other threat is closing in on everybody. And that was, again, really, really interesting.
Yeah, thank you. And having a morally great character to me is, that's what I write. Whether they're kind of labeled as the hero or the villain in the story, they're all morally gray, because that's the reality of the situation. And sometimes it's hard to find that balance. And you mentioned like she's not necessarily likable, and I think that's exactly right. And as an author, I think you're not aiming for likable, you're aiming for empathy. Like the reader doesn't have to like her, but they hopefully they should be wondering what is going, they should be invested in what happens to her. Um, you know, tough stories are ones where you just don't care, and I always think about, a James Bond movie where like James Bond gets shot at a million times and he never gets hit. I start to not care about what happens because nothing ever happens. So I want my characters to struggle, and I want the readers to care about what happens to them, even if they're rooting for them for their demise. But as long as they're invested, that's important, and that's the hard balance to strike. Because you get so close to your story, like does anybody care about it? So you just have to go off of your instinct and intuition. So as long as I care, I'm hoping that that's going to come through.
So I did want to ask a little bit. You have some multimedia in this book, which was a really interesting choice. Did you want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, sure. Thank you. And I've done multimedia in some of my books to different levels, mostly just because it amuses me. But in the case of Tell Me What You Did, Poe, who's the protagonist, she always records her side of the podcast with her iPhone, just for her own safety, because she kind of agrees to erase any Zoom recordings. And I kind of thought when I was writing this, I'm like, I want to see what that looks like. And so I hired an actress, Rebecca Kennedy, who's amazing, to record some of the scenes in the book. And then it's packaged as recovered evidence from the Vermont State Police. So you might read a scene and then you're going to see a QR code at the bottom of the scene. And if you watch the video, you'll kind of see the scene that you just read. And it just amused me to no end to have that in there because she did such a great job. And even my acknowledgments are a QR code video. I just wanted to do something different. And I think it turned out pretty nice.
Are you working on anything now, or are you taking a little bit of a break?
Yeah, I don't take break. I just love to write, and I only write an hour a day. So it's the thing I really look forward to every morning, like what happens. So after I finish a book, it's usually maybe a week that I don't write. But I co-wrote a dark YA thriller, with a buddy of mine that's on submission right now, and I'm almost done with my next standalone. I should finish the first draft this month, hopefully.
How many beta readers do you use?
Very few. It's changed over time. I think I'm at the point now where I don't even like to talk about what I'm writing because even my partner, I tell her very little, not to be coy, but just like, I don't know, it might change. I don't know what I'm doing. So she'll be the first to read it. And then sometimes I workshop a couple chapters with my critique group, but at that point, it's usually just off to my agent. And then she gives me tremendous feedback.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much. I am really excited to see what you have in store next. I think it's amazing. Like every time I think of you, I think of this room that I'm looking at you in. This isn't using video, but like you have so many books in the background and you have all of your book covers framed, which is awesome. So yeah, no, I think like it really just shows how much you enjoy your craft.
Yeah, it's a gift, and I'm so grateful to be able to write because it's a place I get to escape to every day.
All right, so this was Jessica with Syosset Libraries Turn the Page podcast. My guest was
Carter Wilson, and thank you so much, Jessica.
Thank you. We are going to close this chapter of Turn the Page.
It's time to close this chapter of Turn the Page. Join us for the next episode.